Daf Yomi is Nazir Daf Nun, Nazir 50. And today's Daf Yomi, we're going to deal with the ritual impurities of a dead body. So the Talmud, it might sound foreign, there's new terms we might not necessarily be familiar with. And also the concept is foreign to us, but the concepts are not difficult. We just have to just be patient, and they'll eventually come to be second nature to us. So the Talmud says that if a Nazir came in contact with an olive-sized portion of the dead, or an olive-sized portion of Nazir, which is something related to the dead, then the Nazir will become considered like he was Tameh, and he'll have to shave his head and bring the sacrifices. So the Talmud asks on 58, Ezehu Neitzel. What is this Neitzel that we're talking about? So the Talmud explains, it's basar amaze, it's the flesh of the dead body, shekarash. It's the flesh of the body that congealed. And Tosfos explains, shenimoach habasar mitchila, that first it melted, and afterwards, v'achkach karash. And afterwards it congealed. And so too, back to the text of the Gemara, umohel shehir siach. What's the mohel shehir siach? This is some liquid. Tosfos explains that this is mohel hayotze min hameis. This is some liquid secreted from the dead body. V'irsichu ba'or, and it bubbled up. They heated it up in the fire. V'hela resichos, and it brought up bubbles. Hainu neitzel. This is the neitzel. So neitzel is this olive-sized portion of the dead body that melted and then congealed, and the mohel is this liquid that's bubbled up from the dead body. And if you have an olive-sized portion of it and you're in the tent, it's going to transmit the tumah. So the Gemara says, wait 1 second. Hey, Chidami, what's the scenario where we're talking about the olive-sized portion of the neitzel, which it transmits the tumah? If we don't know for sure that it's from the dead body, kikarish mayavi, well then why do we care that it's congealed? We don't know that it's from the dead body. How are we going to say that you have to cut your hair if you're a Nazir out of a doubt? We don't know that you're really a Nazir. We don't know that you're Tameh, and you can't cut your hair out of doubt because that's a prohibition. So just to clarify that, Tosfos says that the question is, it's from the dead body, but there's different elements that could come from the dead body. If it comes from the flesh, then we're going to say that it's tameh. But if it comes from the phlegm or the mucus or the saliva, and then it's no longer in the body, we're going to say it's not tameh. So how do we know what this neitzel or this mohel is from? So that's what Tosfos said. That's what the Gemara says. If we don't know that's for sure from the dead body, kikarish mehavi, what do we care that it's congealed? We know for sure it's from the flesh, and afagav duo karash. We know for sure, and if we would know for sure that's from the flesh, we wouldn't care that it's congealed. It would be tameh. So why are we being told that if it's congealed, if it's literally from the dead body, if we know for sure, we don't care if it's congealed. And if we're not sure if it's from the dead body, then what does it matter? It's congealed. We can't cut our hair. The Nazir can't cut their hair out of a suffix. So I'm Rabbi Yirmiyah Bestam. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says that the answer is, we know that it comes from this dead body, but we don't know if it's from the flesh or from the phlegm. That's what we're talking about. Ikarish mohu. So if it congealed, then we know that it's from the flesh, and it's the melted flesh. And so therefore, it transmits the tumah. But lo karsh, if it doesn't congeal, then dilma, or it doesn't bubble, then dilma kecho v'neohu. Then if it doesn't congeal or bubble up, we're going to say maybe it's the saliva or the phlegm. So now, so now that we said that there's neitzel to transmit the tumah, to make a Nazir tameh, Abaye asked from Rabbah, his Rebbe Rabbah, following question: Yech neitzel behema, ein neitzel behema. Are we going to say that there's neitzel for an animal or not? What's the scenario here? Well, we know that there is tent tumah, which is a human being, a Jew who's dead transmits the tumah by being in the same tent. But there's also other types of tumah. One is an animal, a carcass of an animal, an avela. Let's say you have a sheep that's dead, but it wasn't slaughtered. Or if you have a different animal that's dead. So that transmits the tumah but only by touching it or by carrying it. So now the question becomes, let's say you have an kazayas minan avela. Let's say you have, and this is how Tosfos explains the question. Let's say you have an owl-sized amount from this dead body that it was rotting and it melted. We want to know if it transmits the tumah by touching or carrying it. This has nothing to do with the Nazir. This has nothing to do with the Nazir. It just wants to know that if this animal's flesh is rotted and it's now a neitzel, we want to know if it transmits tumah by touching it. So that's what Abaye asked Rabbi. Yesh neitzel behema, neitzel behema. Mi amrina, do we say gemiri? We have a tradition. Neitzel da'asim mi adam. Do we have a tradition about neitzel that only comes from a human being? Avol da'asim mi behema lo. But we don't say that neitzel, if it comes from an animal, it transmits tumah. If it's rotted, it's not part of the animal anymore. It doesn't transmit tumah. Or maybe there's this concept of neitzel, whether it comes from a human or comes from an animal. And Gemara says we have to further define this question. That when we say an animal transmits tumah, or when we say tumah chamura, to this stringent tumah, meaning to say to give the tumah to a human being, that's adal until it's still edible, until this carcass is still edible by somebody who's not Jewish. Until that point, it's able to transmit tumah. The tumah kawa, and to be able to make other food items, adal kalv, until the item is still edible by a dog. Shapir. According to them, it's going to be a valid question. According to them, we're going to say that this is a valid question. Why is this a valid question? Because we're saying that tumah chamura, until it's edible by a that meaning to say, according to this position, we have no doubt if there's neitzel for a behema. We don't care. Meaning to say shapir doesn't mean it's a valid question. It means we're good. Not that the question is good. Meaning to say that since the neitzel was created after the animal, after the flesh disintegrated, so therefore for this reason we don't care, because it's not going to be able to make somebody tameh, because no longer edible by a person. And so therefore, for sure, it's not going to transmit the tumah chamura. But it's only going to be a question, that it transmits the tumah until it's no longer edible by a dog. Then afilu b'chama. So, then ma'iko memer. Then what are we going to say under those circumstances? Because once it's melting, it's still edible by a dog, presumably. And so therefore, we want to know if this neitzel is going to transmit the tumah to a human being. So the Gemara answers, Tashma himchu. Let's try and answer this from a brisa that the brisa says, himchu ba'or. Let's say you took this piece of flesh from the animal and you melted it in the fire, tamei, bechama, but if you melted it in the sun, tahor. If you melted it in the sun, it's tahor. V'isal kadai technef, you're going to be in the position that until it's edible by the dog, it's going to transmit the tumah. Afil b'chama nami. Even in the sun, we should say it transmits the tumah. So from here we see maybe that there's no law of neitzel by an animal. So the Gemara says no. Emas me'machile basar de'isruach. When does it melt from the sun? Only after it becomes putrid in the chama, in the sun. Even the israch, once it became putrid, havay offer. It's no longer edible by a dog. It's just dirt. So while it's edible by a human and a dog, we're going to say there's a law of neitzel. But afterwards, we wouldn't say there's a law of neitzel. So therefore, it seems to be that there is a law of neitzel by an animal. That's what seems to be the answer. Of course, we don't have this type of tumah anymore today. We're not concerned about tumah from an animal. I don't know because we don't eat the sacred food anymore. So therefore, we don't need to really have a halacha ma'isa here. So Tanan Kohanitzok. So now we go on. Since we're discussing the laws of Tum and Tahara, the Gemara now is going to cite a. The Gemara is going to now cite a Mishnah. The Mishnah says we learn in Mesachas Machshirin. Machshirin talks about when food items are capable of becoming tamei. Kohanitzok tahor. So anything that's poured out, meaning to say, even though if you pour, Tosfos explains that if you pour out something, a liquid, so if you pour out liquid that was tahor into liquid that was tamei from above to below, then we're going to, let's say you have a tahor liquid and you pour it into a tamei liquid. You have a tahor water, you pour it into tamei water. We're going to say that the tahor liquid, which is on top, it still remains tahor, because we're going to say that this pouring does not serve as a connector, not for tumah nor for tahara. So we say ko anitzok tahor chutz min dvash hazipim v'atzapichos, except for honey of zifim and tzapichos. What is honey of zifim? So in the parak Basra of Sota, it explains, as Tosfos says, that what's zifim. Rabbi Yochanan explains that this was honey that they used to be mizayif, forge it, because it was too thick. So they would put in water into it until the water wasn't recognizable. They would water it down, but it was still very thick. Reish Lakish says it comes from a place called Zif. That's why it was called Zifin. And Sapiches is basically they take the honey down from the honeycomb and it's mixed with the wax. The Aruch explains that this Sapiches is a dough that they fried with honey. And so in these cases, we're going to say that if you poured this honey below, we're going to say that the honey was tar, but it's poured into something below, which is tamei. We're going to say it's tamei, because since it's so thick, it's considered like food. And then once it's like food, we're going to say the upper one and the bottom one are mixed together. And so in that case, where the thing being poured is so thick, we're going to say it's a food item, and then it's mixed together, and therefore it's tamei. So go back to the Mishnah in Machshirin. Ko anitzok tahor. Everything that you pour in is tahor, except for the honey, the dvash hazifim, and the tzapichas, which is tamei. Beis Shammai omrim, on top of Nun Beis. Beis Shammai taught af hamikpah shal grisin v'shapol. Also, this porridge of beans, grisin or pol, whole beans or split beans. Also, these items are going to be considered tamei if you pour them into something tamei, because it jumps back. The porridge jumps back. When you stop the pour, it comes right back up. It's that thick. So by Rami Bar Chama, so now Rami Bar Chama asked the question, so he says, let's say in a case where he's saying specifically, is there this law of nitzok? Do we say that the food items will be connected? What's the case we're talking about? So the Tosfos says we're talking about the following case. Let's say you took a piece of meat and you melted down the fat, and then you poured it into food item that was tamei. Are we going to say it's connected or not? Yesh nitzok la'ochen or ein nitzok la'ochen. Mi amrina, do we say mishum the isbahu riri, the honey leisbahu riri? Do we say that what's the reason why the honey and the porridge are going to become tameis? Because they have strands, and the strands jump back up, and that's going to be like a type of tape or glue. And so when you stop pouring it, it pulls it back up. And so therefore it's like food item that it's connected. And so therefore this fat that you melted down has no strands, and therefore it's not tamei. Or maybe it's because they are thick. Maybe the whole concern is that they're thick. And so also here, this fat that you melted down is still going to be thick. And so therefore it's going to be, and even though you poured it, it's going to become tamei. So Amar Rava Tashma, Rava says, let's learn it from the following case. Chelef HaMeis, so this is a Tosefta of Olalos. Let's say you have the fat from a dead body, Shu Shalem, that this fat from a dead body was whole, Vihiticho. And so normally speaking, we're saying the fat of a dead body is going to transmit the ritual impurity if it's the size of an olive, like the flesh of a dead body. And so it was an olive size, but then you melted it down. Now we're going to say it is tameh, but I am mufurad. But let's say it was separated into different pieces, v'ticho, and then you melted it down. Then we're going to say it's tahor. That is tahor, because prior to you melting it down, if you would have touched a portion of it, you would have been tahor because you didn't touch an olive-sized portion of the dead. And so therefore, even though it became connected when it's melted, we're going to say it's tahor because there the connection was made by a person is not going to be considered like it's a full olive size, and therefore it's not going to become tameh. And now the Gemara basically Rava says so. Let's answer our question now, whether or not there's nitzok for ochlin, and if you're going to say that there's no connection by pouring for food item, if it's whole and then it became melted down, it should also be tahor, because at the moment you put it on the fire, for sure one part is going to separate from the other part when it melts. And so therefore we're going, if we say nitzok is not connected, then it's not connected. So even though at the end it's going to become connected, so you're like, it's disconnected for a while. So we see from here that there is nitzuk for chibur. So Gemara says, no, that's not a good proof. Amar Bizera Ana Umar Braid Ravina Tirgamina Hachama Eskinan. Now here what we're talking about is going the Bahade de Merasach de Merasachwe Sa Kamuda de Nuro Puma de Mana. No, here what we're talking about is when you're boiling it up, there is going to come this fat this fat from the dead body jumped up into the utensil at once, the karish, and it all congealed together. The isa kul gabi adadi. So we're talking about a scenario where the fat was whole and it wasn't into little pieces where it jumped into the fire all at once. So the Gemara says, we still want to answer this question, whether or not there's nitzak for ochin or not. Let's bring a proof from what Beis Shammai said, because what was Beis Shammai's position? So Beis Shammai says, also the porridge and the beans are going to become tameh because they jump back. So therefore we're going to consider like that because they jump back, we're going to consider like the two food items are connected. And so that's the reasoning, presumably also according to the Tanna Kama. Now, what's the reason why the honey is tameh? Because it jumps back and they have these strands that bring them back. And so therefore, only if there's the strands in the food item will we say that it's going to be connected. But the regular food item doesn't have the strands, because they don't jump back, we're going to say that the pouring is not going to connect them. It just depends on the food item, if it has the strands or not. So the Gemara says, no, midday area, that's not the case. So really, that case is totally different, because the Tanna Kama, what's the reason why Tanna Kama says that the honey is going to be connected and it's going to transmit the tumah through pouring it? It's not because they have the strands, but because they're thick, not because of the strands. And so therefore, but by the strands, even Beis Shammai is going to agree with it, Bishum Riri, because it's because of the strands. But the Tanna Kama doesn't require the strands. And so therefore, the Tanna Kama would seem to be, in our case of the general question, he would say there's nitzuk for ochin as well. So now we said that if there was a molel tarvad of reket, if there was a spoonful of corpse tumah, we're going to say it transmits the tumah. Like if the body decomposes and we see that the bones become a spoonful of dust, it transmits a tumah. The kama shiro, what's molel tarvad? What is this spoonful of dust. It's really bigger than a spoon, as we'll see. So Chizkiah says, Melo Fisa Sayad, the fullness of the palm of the hand. Rabbi Yochanan says, Melo Chafnav, the fullness of the hand, meaning to say from the wrist until the tip of the fingers. Tanan, Melo Tarvad Rakav Shamru. So how do we answer this question? Which one is it? Is it like Chizkiah or like Rabbi Yochanan? So we learned in the Mishnah in, where is this Mishnah? So it's actually not a Mishnah, it's a Braisa, it's a Tosefta and Oros, even though it says Tanan. The Mefarish says it's a Braisa. Melo Tarvad Rakav Shamru, what is the size of this? A ladle full of corpse tuma. Yeshna meikar etzbos ulamala. Divrei Meir. Meir says it comes from basically the knuckles, where the fingers start till the tip of the knuckles. Chamam omer melo chafna. Chum say no, it's the fullness of the hands. So Bishlam Rabbi Yochanan hu da'amar Rabbanan. It makes sense. Rabbi Yochanan Shita, he's holding like the Rabbanan. Ela Chizkiah, come on, who is Chizkiah holding like? Woke Rabbi Meir. Chizkiah, who says it's just the palm. He is not like Rabbi Meir, who says it's from the knuckles to the tip of the fingers. And it's not like Rabbanan, who say it's the whole hand. So Amri, so the Gemara answers no. The Gemara says no. When Chizkiah says it's the fullness of the hand, i.e., when it's just the palm, and also from the knuckles to the tip of the fingers, that's the same amount. That's the same size. How do we know that when he says from the knuckles to the tip, that refers to the tip of the fingers? So maybe it's from the knuckles to the wrist, which is exactly the same thing that Chizkiah is saying. The Gemara says teku. We leave this question unresolved, but actually Tosfos writes that we shouldn't say the word teku here because it's not really a question that's typical of teku. We say the language of Nazir is Mashuna, the language of Nazir is different. We see that the earth of the ladle is of the decomposed bones is going to transmit the tumah. We're going to see on the next stuff that has to be no clothing involved. It has to be not in a coffin. And so a lot of people say, well, it's very hard to imagine such a scenario. But I saw in my own eyes the horrible situation of the Rekev Tumah when I went to the death camp, Belzik. And even though it was 70 years after, or more than 60 years after, the Jews were murdered in the hundreds of thousands in Belzik, their bones were decomposed, crushed, and lying over the earth. Hashem should have mercy on all of us in this horrible scene I have ingrained in my eyes. Okay, we'll stop the recording here, but we can read for a couple more minutes.